March 15, 1944, 25,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. The Messerschmitt pilot from Munich spotted the American fighters 8 miles out and allowed himself a small smile. P-51 Mustangs. The Americans called them fighters, but every German pilot knew better. They were escort planes, nothing more. Pretty aluminum toys that ran for home when real fighters showed up. He'd shot down 2 of them last month without breaking a sweat. His wingman, a veteran with 37 kills, waggled his wings, the signal for an easy hunt. They pushed their throttles forward and climbed toward the sun. The American formation looked perfect from 5 miles out. 16 Mustangs weaving above a bomber stream that stretched to the horizon. The German pilot checked his ammunition counters. Full loads in all weapons. 2 30mm cannons in the wings, 2 20mm cannons in the nose, and the 13mm machine guns for good measure. The Mustang carried 6 machine guns firing rifle bullets. It was like bringing a knife to an artillery duel. He'd seen those .50 caliber rounds bounce off a Focke-Wulf's armor plate, watched them spark harmlessly against engine cowlings. The Americans hadn't learned yet that machine guns belonged in the last war. At 2 miles, something felt wrong. The Mustangs weren't scattering, weren't climbing to meet them or diving away. They maintained their weave, patient as spiders. The flight leader from Texas had spotted the Germans 10 minutes ago. Let them come. His ammunition loadout was different from what those Germans expected. Every 5th round was an M8 armor-piercing incendiary, a little piece of hell wrapped in copper and steel. The chemical compound inside burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum, hot enough to turn aviation fuel into an inferno, hot enough to make a Messerschmitt pilot reconsider everything he thought he knew about American fighters. The merge happened at 400 miles per hour. The German pilot lined up a deflection shot on the trailing Mustang, leading it perfectly. His cannon rounds walked across empty sky. The Mustang had rolled inverted and pulled through, something German pilots were told it couldn't do at altitude. Now it was behind him, and the first burst of those .50 caliber guns didn't sound like machine guns at all. They sounded like hammers hitting sheet metal. The rounds punched through his tail section like it was paper. One hit the elevator control cable, and suddenly his stick felt different, heavier. The second burst walked up his fuselage, and he saw the flash of impacts, not the spark of regular rounds. These were burning through his aircraft's skin, leaving holes with glowing edges. The incendiary compound in each M8 round was designed to ignite after penetration, pierce the armor, then burn. The German pilot felt the heat before he saw the smoke. Something behind his seat was burning, the ammunition magazine for his starboard cannon probably. He had 10 seconds, maybe 15, before the whole wing departed the aircraft. The Mustang pilot from Texas watched the Messerschmitt roll away trailing black smoke and shifted his attention to the wingman. The German was trying to climb into the sun using the Me-109's superior climb rate. Classic move. Would have worked against the earlier P-51B model. But this was a P-51D with a Merlin engine breathing methanol at altitude. The American followed him up, closing the distance yard by yard. The wingman made his mistake at 28,000 feet, tried to stall turn at the top of his climb, expecting the Mustang to mush out in the thin air. Instead, the American pilot kicked hard rudder and snapped the Mustang around its axis, a move that would have killed him in any other Allied fighter. The guns hammered again, 6 streams of mixed ammunition, ball, tracer, armor-piercing, and armor-piercing incendiary. The tracers drew lines across the sky. The ball rounds hammered the structure, the armor-piercing punched through protection, and the incendiary rounds started fires in places fires shouldn't start. The German's engine cowling split open. Oil sprayed across his windscreen, followed by flames. Actual flames at 28,000 feet, where the air was too thin to breathe and cold enough to freeze water instantly. 2 parachutes blossomed against the blue. Both German pilots survived, which was more than most could say after meeting the new Mustangs. They'd report back to their squadrons about American fighters that could turn, climb, and dive with the best German aircraft. About machine guns that weren't really machine guns anymore, about rounds that burned through armor like acid. The war had changed while they weren't paying attention. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Mustang 650s were the teeth that bit. The mechanic from Pittsburgh had loaded those guns himself that morning, 280 rounds per gun inboard, 350 rounds for the middle and outboard guns. Every fifth round was the M8 armor-piercing Incendiary that made all the difference. He'd learned the loading pattern from a gunner who'd survived 25 missions over Germany. The man had been specific about the mix. Too many incendiary rounds and the guns would overheat, too few and you might as well be throwing rocks. The sweet spot was 1 in 5, with tracers every 10th round so the pilot could see where his rounds were going. Simple math that added up to dead Germans. The factory in Detroit that produced those M8 rounds was running 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Each round started as a copper slug that got drilled, filled with the incendiary compound, sealed, and fitted with a hardened steel penetrator. The chemical mixture was classified, but the workers knew it contained barium nitrate and aluminum powder. They called it Detroit Lightning. One worker, a grandmother from Hamtramck, had 4 sons in Europe. She personally inspected every 1,000th round, looking for imperfections that might cause a jam. A jammed gun at 20,000 feet meant some mother's son wasn't coming home. She hadn't let a bad round through in 6 months. That same morning, 60 miles from the air battle, another German pilot prepared for his first combat mission in 3 months. He'd been shot down over France by a P-47 Thunderbolt, bellied in his 109 in a wheat field, and walked 8 days to reach German lines. During his recovery, he'd heard the stories. Mustangs ranging all the way to Berlin, Mustangs bouncing flights at 30,000 feet, Mustangs whose guns could pierce the armor plate behind a pilot's seat. He'd laughed at that last one. 50 caliber machine guns were annoyances, not threats. His crew chief had shown him the armor plate from a recovered Mustang victim. The holes were perfectly round, melted through rather than punched. Whoever had been sitting in front of that plate had burned to death at altitude. The truth about the M8 rounds had filtered through the Luftwaffe by spring of 1944, but knowing and countering were different things. The Germans tried adding more armor, but weight meant sacrificing performance. They tried new tactics, attacking from angles that minimized exposure, but the Mustang could follow them anywhere. They tried flying at extreme altitudes where the thin air should have given their supercharged engines an advantage. But the Mustang's Merlin engine, with its 2-stage supercharger, performed even better up high. Every solution created new problems. Every adaptation met a counter-adaptation. The Americans had finally built a fighter that could do everything well and armed it with ammunition that turned machine guns into cannons. The lieutenant from Ohio had been flying escort missions for 2 months without firing his guns in anger. Today was different. Today the Germans came up in force, 40 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, rising from airfields around Brunswick to intercept the bomber stream heading for aircraft factories. The Mustang squadrons spread out to meet them, and suddenly the sky was full of turning, burning aircraft. The lieutenant found himself in a climbing spiral with a Focke-Wulf 190, each pilot trying to gain advantage. The German fighter was heavier, more powerful at low altitude, but they were passing through 20,000 feet and climbing. The air was getting thinner, and the Mustang was getting stronger. At 22,000 feet, the Focke-Wulf stalled. The pilot had pushed too hard, trusted his aircraft's reputation too much. The lieutenant rolled over the top and came down behind the German, who was desperately trying to recover airspeed. The range was 300 yards, too far for the German cannons that had made the Focke-Wulf feared. Perfect for the Mustang's 50s. The first burst walked across the German's left wing. Regular ball ammunition would have made holes, maybe damaged a control surface. The M8 rounds burned through the wing's main spar. The aluminum structure softened, weakened, failed. The wing folded upward, and the Focke-Wulf entered an unrecoverable spin, no parachute. The pilot rode it all the way down, 15,000 feet to impact. The incendiary effect wasn't just about burning through armor. It was psychological warfare delivered at 1,200 feet per second. German pilots who had treated combat like a chess match, calculating angles and energy states, now had to factor in the possibility of instant immolation. One pilot described being hit by M8 rounds as watching his aircraft dissolve around him. The rounds had punched through his engine block, and the incendiary compound had ignited the oil. Within seconds, flames were eating through firewall, consuming hydraulic lines, cooking off ammunition. He'd barely escaped, and the memory of those few seconds, the heat, the smoke, the metal twisting as it burned, haunted him enough that he never flew combat again. The bomber crews watched these fights with fascination and relief. For 2 years, they'd watched German fighters slice through their formations, picking off bombers like wolves culling sheep. The early escort fighters, P-47s and P-38s, had helped, but they couldn't go all the way to the target. The Germans had learned to wait, to hit the bombers in that gap between where the escorts turned back and the target. Now the Mustangs went all the way to Berlin and back, and those guns that looked so inadequate were dropping Germany's best pilots into the Baltic Sea. The ammunition supply chain stretched from Detroit to England in an unbroken river of lead and steel. Liberty ships carried millions of rounds across the Atlantic, dodging U-boats and winter storms. Trains hauled them from Liverpool to airfields scattered across East Anglia. Ammunition crews sorted them, stored them, loaded them into belts. Each Mustang sortie used about 2,000 rounds, assuming the pilot was conservative with his trigger. Some pilots burned through their entire load in a single engagement. The crew chiefs didn't complain. Empty ammunition boxes meant German aircraft weren't going home. The captain from California had been an instructor before shipping to England. He'd taught gunnery at Nellis, drilling into cadets the importance of deflection shooting, leading the target, calculating where the enemy would be when your rounds arrived. With the M8 rounds, the rules changed slightly. You didn't need to hit the engine specifically. Hit anywhere in the engine compartment, and the incendiary would find something to burn. Oil, fuel, hydraulic fluid, all of it burned when exposed to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd shot down 4 Germans in 6 weeks, each with less than a 3-second burst. Economy of ammunition. Let the chemistry do the work. His wingman was new, a kid from Brooklyn who'd never seen a German fighter until today. The kid was trying to line up a perfect shot on a Messerschmitt that was weaving through the bomber formation. The captain called him off. Too much risk of hitting friendlies. Instead, they climbed above the fight and waited. Patience was a weapon, too. Sure enough, a Focke-Wulf broke off from attacking a straggling B-17 and headed for the deck, probably low on fuel or ammunition. The captain rolled in behind him, letting gravity add to his speed. The German never saw them coming. The rounds hit just behind the cockpit, walking forward. The armor-piercing cores punched through. The incendiary compound ignited. The German pilot's canopy turned orange from internal fire before the aircraft simply came apart, wings separating from the fuselage in a shower of burning fragments. The kid from Brooklyn vomited in his oxygen mask. First kill nerves, mixed with the reality of what those rounds actually did to another human being. The captain understood. He'd lost his lunch after his first kill, too. The M8 rounds didn't just destroy aircraft. They destroyed them spectacularly, violently. Finally, there was no limping home with M8 damage, no belly landing in a field. When those rounds found something vital, the aircraft died, and usually the pilot died with it. It was horrific. It was necessary. It was winning the war. The German pilot from Hamburg had 23 kills and considered himself an expert on American fighters. He'd shot down P-38 Lightnings over Africa, P-47 Thunderbolts over France, and even bagged a Spitfire by mistake over the Channel. The early model P-51s hadn't impressed him. Good range, decent speed. but nothing special in a fight. Then they'd upgraded the engine, improved the canopy, and apparently done something to the ammunition. His squadron had lost 8 pilots in 2 weeks to Mustangs. Good pilots, veterans, men who didn't make mistakes. The intelligence officer blamed it on numerical superiority, but the pilot knew better. Those guns were different now. He found out how different at 16,000 feet over Hanover. He'd bounced a straggling B-24 that had lost 2 engines and fallen behind the formation. Easy meat. He was lining up his second pass when the Mustangs appeared, 2 of them coming down from the sun. He broke hard left, pulling 7 Gs, graying out from the blood draining from his brain. The Mustang followed him through the turn. Impossible. No American fighter could turn with a 109 at combat weight, but there it was, inside his turn, pulling lead. He reversed, rolling right and diving. The Mustang followed like it was tied to his tail with a rope. The first rounds hit his port wing. He felt the impacts through the stick. Heavy hits, not the peppering he expected from .50 caliber guns. Then he saw the smoke. Black smoke from inside his wing. The fuel tank was in there, self-sealing, but not against whatever these rounds were. The fire started 10 seconds later, just a flicker of orange along the wing root, then spreading backward in the slipstream. The pilot from Hamburg had always wondered if he'd have the courage to stay with a burning aircraft long enough to bail out properly. Now he knew. The fire reached the cockpit in 20 seconds. His flight suit started smoking. The canopy release jammed from heat distortion. He shot it off with his flare pistol and rolled the aircraft inverted. Gravity pulled him out, and the slipstream hit him like a frozen sledgehammer. His parachute opened at 8,000 feet. He watched his Messerschmitt, the aircraft he'd flown for 8 months and decorated with 23 kill marks, turn into a meteor, falling toward German soil. The Mustang circled him once, the pilot checking that he was clear of the aircraft, then rejoined his wingman. Professional courtesy. The war would continue tomorrow, but today, one more German expert was walking home. The arms factory in Detroit received reports from the field and constantly refined the M8 design. They experimented with different chemical compositions, trying to increase burn temperature without sacrificing stability. A round that exploded in the gun was worse than useless. They tested different penetrator tips, balancing hardness against weight. Too hard and the round might shatter against face-hardened armor. Too soft and it wouldn't penetrate at all. The sweet spot was a tungsten carbide core that could punch through an inch of armor plate at 500 yards, then deliver its incendiary payload into whatever lay behind. The mathematical reality was simple and brutal. Each Mustang carried 1,800 rounds total. In a 2-second burst, those 6 guns put out about 200 rounds, with 20% being M8 armor-piercing incendiary. That meant 40 rounds designed to burn through armor and start fires. 40 chances to find something critical. 40 opportunities for catastrophic failure. The German fighters, for all their cannon armament and armor protection, couldn't survive that level of concentrated destruction. The ones that tried to go head-to-head with Mustangs learned that machine guns had evolved past their understanding. The sergeant from Alabama had been a crew chief for 6 months, nursing Mustangs through 100-mission lives. He'd seen them come back with cylinder heads shot off, control cables severed, hydraulics bleeding red fluid across aluminum skin. But they came back. That was the difference. A Mustang could take punishment and make it home. The German fighters, especially when hit by M8 rounds, usually didn't get that chance. He'd inspected captured German aircraft, studied their armor schemes, understood their vulnerability. The Germans had armored against the threats they knew: British 20mm cannons, American .50 caliber ball ammunition. They hadn't armored against chemistry, against rounds that turned armor itself into a liability by trapping fire inside the aircraft. The evolution had been gradual but decisive. The early P-51s, with their Allison engines, had been decent fighters below 15,000 feet, Add the Merlin engine, and they became good fighters up to 30,000 feet. Improve the ammunition, and suddenly they were killers at any altitude. The Germans tried to adapt, but adaptation took time they didn't have. By summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. The rookies facing Mustangs armed with M8 rounds lasted days instead of months. The mathematics of attrition had turned against Germany. The colonel from Virginia read the intelligence reports with satisfaction and concern. Mustang pilots were claiming unprecedented kill ratios, but German fighter production hadn't decreased. They were building more fighters than ever, but couldn't find pilots capable of flying them effectively. The M8 rounds had created a psychological barrier. German pilots who might have pressed attacks against regular machine gun armament now broke off at longer ranges. They'd learned that closing to cannon range meant passing through the Mustang's effective envelope, where those 650s could surgically disassemble their aircraft. The tactical dynamic had shifted from close-in dogfighting to longer-range positioning battles. The Mustang, with its superior speed and altitude performance, excelled at this game. The mission on April 8, 1944, demonstrated the new reality. 312 Mustangs escorted 800 bombers to aircraft factories in central Germany. The Luftwaffe sent up 150 fighters to intercept. In the resulting battle, spread across 200 miles of sky, the Mustangs claimed 63 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 8 P-51s. The kill ratio would have been impossible a year earlier. But the combination of improved aircraft performance, experienced pilots, and the devastating effectiveness of M8 ammunition had created a perfect storm of aerial superiority. The mechanic from Minnesota had loaded M8 rounds for that mission. He took pride in the mechanical precision of his work. Each belt had to feed perfectly. Each round had to chamber cleanly. A jam at 25,000 feet wasn't just inconvenient. It was potentially fatal. He'd developed a system, inspecting each round before loading, checking for corrosion or damage that might cause problems. The M8 rounds got special attention. Their incendiary compound was stable but required respect. Drop one on concrete and nothing happened. But subject it to the heat and pressure of penetrating armor and it became devil's fire. He'd seen test footage of M8 rounds hitting armor plate. The entry hole glowed white-hot for several seconds, hot enough to ignite anything flammable within a foot radius. German pilots began developing specific tactics to counter the Mustang threat. They tried high-altitude attacks from directly above, using dive speed to slash through formations before the escorts could react. They tried low-altitude infiltration, coming in under the bomber streams where the Mustang's speed advantage was minimized. They tried night fighting, catching bombers in searchlights where the Mustangs couldn't effectively protect them. Each tactic worked once, maybe twice, before the Americans adapted. The Mustang squadrons started maintaining high-altitude caps above the bombers. They stationed flights at low altitude to catch infiltrators. They even experimented with night escort missions, though those proved less successful. The lieutenant from Oregon had been part of the high-altitude cap during a mission to Stuttgart, cruising at 31,000 feet, so high that ice crystals formed inside his canopy, despite the heater running full blast. His flight spotted German rockets climbing from below, Me-163 Comets, rocket-powered interceptors that could climb to bomber altitude in less than 3 minutes. The German wonder weapons were supposed to restore air superiority through revolutionary technology. But technology without tactics was just expensive failure. The Comets climbed in straight lines, predictable as sunrise. The Mustangs rolled over and dove, building tremendous speed in the descent. The closing rate was over 600 miles per hour. The lieutenant had maybe 2 seconds of firing time as he flashed past the climbing rocket fighter. 2 seconds was enough. His rounds struck the Comet just behind the cockpit where the volatile rocket fuel was stored. M8 rounds and rocket fuel proved incompatible with continued flight. The comet didn't just explode, it detonated like a small atomic bomb, the blast wave buffeting the lieutenant's Mustang even as he pulled out of his dive 500 yards away. The German pilot never had a chance to eject. One moment he was climbing toward the bombers, the next he was distributed across several cubic miles of atmosphere. The other comets immediately dove away, their pilots having witnessed what happened when 20th century chemistry met 21st century ambition. The psychological impact rippled through the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had volunteered for dangerous assignments began finding reasons to stay on the ground. Mechanical problems increased dramatically. Engines that wouldn't start, instruments that suddenly needed calibration, radios that mysteriously failed. The German High Command threatened court-martials for cowardice, but how could they prove a magneto hadn't actually failed? The mechanics, many of whom had lost friends to Mustangs, became mysteriously incompetent at finding and fixing these problems. Better a grounded pilot than a dead one. The captain from Missouri understood the German predicament because he'd studied it extensively. Before the war, he'd been a history professor specializing in military tactics. He understood that air superiority wasn't just about shooting down enemy aircraft, it was about making the enemy afraid to fly. The M8 rounds had achieved that goal more effectively than any propaganda campaign. German pilots weren't just afraid of being shot down anymore, they were afraid of burning to death at 20,000 feet, of having their aircraft dissolve around them in sheets of chemical fire. That fear made them hesitant, and hesitation in air combat was death. He'd witnessed this hesitation firsthand during a mission to Hamburg. A staffel of Focke-Wulf 190s had positioned perfectly for a bounce on his squadron. They had altitude, speed, and surprise. Everything favored the Germans except psychology. At the critical moment, when they should have pressed their attack, the German leader hesitated. Maybe he was calculating angles. Maybe he was remembering a friend who'd burned. Maybe he was just tired. That hesitation gave the captain time to call out the threat, to turn his squadron into the attack. The Focke-Wulfs scattered rather than face head-on passes against Mustangs. 2 still went down, caught by aggressive pursuit. The rest escaped, but they'd failed their mission. The bombers they were supposed to stop continued unmolested to Hamburg. The arms manufacturers had initially produced 1 M8 round for every 10 standard ball rounds. By spring of 1944, they were producing 1 for every 5, and frontline squadrons were demanding even more. The chemical components came from facilities across America. Barium nitrate from chemical plants in New Jersey, aluminum powder from smelters in Tennessee, tungsten for the penetrators from mines in Colorado. The entire industrial might of America was focused on producing ammunition that could burn through German armor and German resolve simultaneously. The private from Louisiana working in the ammunition depot in England had handled millions of rounds without really thinking about their ultimate purpose. They were just metal objects to be sorted, stored, and shipped. Then he'd visited a Mustang base to see where his work ended up. He watched crew chiefs loading belts, carefully alternating round types according to pilot preference. He met a pilot who'd used those rounds to save a crippled bomber over Berlin, shooting down 2 German fighters that were lining up to finish the wounded B-17. The bomber made it home with half its crew wounded, but alive. 10 men who got to see another sunrise because those M8 rounds had burned through a Messerschmitt's engine block at the perfect moment. The technical specifications of the M8 round seemed mundane on paper. Weight, 1.56 ounces. Muzzle velocity, 240 feet per second. Effective range, 1,000 yards. But those numbers didn't capture the reality of what happened when tungsten met aluminum at nearly 3,000 feet per second, when chemical fire met aviation fuel at 20 degrees below zero, when American industrial capacity met German fighter production in the skies over Europe. The rounds were poetry written in physics, each one a tiny ambassador of American determination to end the war through superior firepower. By May of 1944, the Mustang had established clear air superiority over Western Europe. German fighters still rose to challenge bomber formations, but increasingly it was a one-way trip. The mathematics had become insurmountable. For every German pilot trained, the Americans were training 5. For every German fighter produced, the Americans were building 3. For every standard round the Germans fired, the Americans answered with armor-piercing incendiary that made armor irrelevant. The Luftwaffe was dying not in one climactic battle, but in 1,000 small engagements where M8 rounds found fuel lines, oil tanks, ammunition magazines. The major from Pennsylvania had flown 47 missions by D-Day. He'd shot down 11 German aircraft, each kill recorded in gun camera footage that showed the devastating effect of M8 rounds. In one frame, a Messerschmitt flew straight and level. In the next, impacts sparked along its fuselage. In the third, fire erupted from the engine compartment. By the 5th frame, the aircraft was coming apart, wings folding, tail separating, pilot still trapped inside. The entire sequence took less than a second in real time. The major felt no particular satisfaction reviewing these films. They were simply evidence that the system worked. American fighters with American ammunition were clearing the skies for American bombers to destroy German industry. His crew chief, a machinist from Detroit who'd helped design the tooling for M8 production, understood the elegance of the system. Every component had been optimized through thousands of iterations: the copper jacket that guided the round down the barrel, the steel penetrator that punched through armor, the incendiary compound that burned with inexorable fury. Each element had been refined to perfection. He'd suggested improvements that made it back to the factory, small modifications that increased reliability or effectiveness. The feedback loop from combat to production was measured in weeks, not months. By the time German engineers understood a problem, American workers had already implemented the solution. The raids on German oil production in late spring of 1944 demonstrated the accumulated effect of American air superiority. Hundreds of bombers hit synthetic oil plants, while Mustangs swept the skies clear of defenders. The few German fighters that made it through the escort screen faced fortress formations bristling with .50 caliber guns, many now loaded with M8 rounds for self-defense. Even the bombers had become deadly to approach. One German pilot described attacking a B-17 formation as flying into a wall of burning light. The tracers were just the visible component. Between them flew invisible death in the form of armor-piercing incendiary that could find the smallest weakness in aircraft armor. The lieutenant from Colorado had been a mining engineer before the war. He understood the metallurgy involved in the M8 round, the precise temperatures required to create tungsten carbide penetrators, the chemistry that made the incendiary compound stable enough to handle but reactive enough to destroy. He'd calculated that each German fighter shot down represented roughly 10,000 man-hours of German production, mining the aluminum, refining the steel, assembling the engine, training the pilot. Each M8 round cost the American taxpayer about 30 cents to produce. The economic exchange rate was roughly 30 cents of American ammunition to destroy $300,000 of German war machine. It was the best investment America had ever made. The German response evolved from denial to desperation. They tried copying captured M8 rounds, but lacked the tungsten for mass production. They added more armor to their fighters, but weight-degraded performance until they couldn't catch bombers, much less fight escorts. They developed jet fighters that could outrun Mustangs, but jets consumed fuel at rates Germany couldn't sustain with its oil production under constant attack. Every solution created new problems, and all the while, American production of M8 rounds continued to increase. By June of 1944, Mustang squadrons were receiving shipments where every third round was armor-piercing incendiary. The corporal from Utah had joined the Army Air Forces to escape a future in copper mining. Now he found himself loading copper-jacketed death into ammunition belts 12 hours a day. He'd developed a rhythm, a meditation of motion, that let him load 2,000 rounds an hour without conscious thought. Left hand picks up round. Right hand guides it into link. Thumb presses home. Repeat. The M8 rounds felt slightly different, heavier at the tip where the tungsten penetrator sat. He'd learned to identify them by touch, ensuring the proper mix without looking. One standard ball, one standard ball, one M8. One standard ball, one tracer. The pattern repeated 1,800 times per aircraft. 6 aircraft per flight, 4 flights per squadron. The mission to Munich on June 9, 1944, saw the new ammunition mix in full effect. German fighters rose in unprecedented numbers, over 200 aircraft attempting to break through to the bomber stream. The Mustang escort, now numbering over 400 aircraft, met them in what became the largest air battle over Germany to date. The sky from 20,000 to 30,000 feet became a three-dimensional chess game played at 400 miles per hour with chemical fire as the winning move. Gun cameras recorded dozens of German aircraft simply disintegrating under concentrated fire, M8 rounds finding ammunition magazines and fuel tanks with devastating consistency. The lieutenant from Idaho watched his rounds walk across a Messerschmitt's fuselage from tail to cockpit. Each impact flashed white-hot, the incendiary compound igniting on penetration. The German pilot was probably dead before the fire reached his position, killed by hydrostatic shock or fragments, but his aircraft continued burning as it fell, a meteor descending through successive layers of air combat. Other German pilots saw it falling and understood the message. These weren't the machine guns their training had prepared them to face. These were something new, something that made their careful calculations of armor angles and thickness irrelevant. The psychological warfare aspect extended beyond individual pilots. Ground crews at German airfields watched their carefully maintained aircraft return with wounds that couldn't be repaired. M8 rounds didn't just make holes, they burned channels through structure. Aluminum crystallized from heat exposure. Steel warped beyond recovery. Aircraft that might have been patched and returned to service after conventional damage were write-offs after M8 strikes. The Germans began cannibalizing damaged fighters for spare parts, but even undamaged components from M8 victims were suspect. How much heat stress could an engine mount take before failing catastrophically? The sergeant from Arkansas had been a metallurgist before enlisting. He inspected battle-damaged Mustangs, studying how German ammunition affected American aluminum. The 20-millimeter cannon rounds made clean holes that could be patched. The 30-millimeter rounds were more destructive, but still repairable if they hadn't hit anything critical. But when he examined captured German aircraft hit by M8 rounds, he saw something different. The metal around impact points had fundamentally changed. The aluminum had partially melted and reformed with different crystalline structure. It was weaker, unpredictable, dangerous. No wonder German pilots were increasingly reluctant to engage. Their aircraft were becoming flying time bombs after even minor M8 damage. The raid on Ploesti's oil fields saw the new reality in stark relief. Mustangs flew the entire route from Italy, a round trip of over 1,300 miles. German fighters intercepted them over Yugoslavia, expecting tired pilots low on fuel. Instead, they met fresh pilots who'd been nursing their engines, saving their ammunition for this moment. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. 8 German fighters went down, 5 to M8 strikes that turned their aircraft into falling torches visible from 20 miles away. The psychological impact rippled through German fighter bases across the Balkans. If the Americans could reach Ploesti with fighter escort carrying that Hellfire ammunition, nowhere was safe. The captain from Washington had been an aeronautical engineer at Boeing before joining up. He understood the physics involved when an M8 round met an aircraft structure at closing speeds, sometimes exceeding 600 miles per hour. The kinetic energy alone was devastating, but the chemical energy released by the incendiary compound multiplied the effect exponentially. He'd calculated that a single M8 round hitting a fuel tank delivered the equivalent energy of a small artillery shell. 6 guns firing 200 rounds in a 2-second burst meant 40 M8 rounds seeking critical components. The probability of catastrophic damage approached certainty. His calculations proved accurate during a mission over Frankfurt, when he caught a Junkers 88 night fighter trying to infiltrate the bomber stream. The twin-engine fighter was heavily armored, designed to absorb punishment from bomber defensive guns. The captain put a 3-second burst into its starboard engine. The M8 rounds punched through the armor, ignited the oil, which ignited the fuel, which ignited the ammunition for the fighter's forward-firing cannons. The Junkers didn't just go down, it exploded in midair, both engines separating from the fuselage in balls of orange fire. The crew never had a chance to bail out. They were probably dead before they knew they were under attack. The relentless mathematics of attrition accelerated through the summer of 1944. D-Day saw the Luftwaffe attempt maximum effort to stop the invasion. They managed fewer than 300 sorties against tens of thousands of Allied aircraft. Mustangs with M8 ammunition swept them from the sky with brutal efficiency. One German pilot who survived described flying through a curtain of fire where every round seemed guided by malevolent intelligence. The Americans had so much ammunition they could afford to fill the sky with it, and only one round had to find something vital. The German pilot made one pass at the invasion beaches, dropped his bombs in the general direction of shipping, and ran for home. He never flew combat again. The private from Maine loading ammunition at a forward base in France after D-Day had developed strong hands from his work. Each ammunition box weighed 60 pounds loaded. He moved dozens per day, keeping Mustangs supplied for the constant patrols over the advancing Allied armies. He'd learned to read the pilots' faces when they returned. The ones who'd used their ammunition came back different, older, quieter, focused on something beyond the horizon. They'd seen what M8 rounds did to aircraft and the men inside them. It wasn't clean or heroic. It was industrial murder delivered at the speed of sound, and it was winning the war one burned German fighter at a time. The evolution of tactics continued as German pilots became increasingly desperate. They tried mass attacks, hoping to overwhelm escort fighters through numbers. But massing aircraft just gave Mustang pilots more targets, and M8 rounds didn't care if they hit the leader or the wingman. They tried individual infiltration, single fighters sneaking through clouds to reach bomber formations. But lone fighters couldn't defend themselves against multiple Mustangs, and running meant presenting their least armored aspect to those deadly 50s. They tried ramming attacks, trading their aircraft and lives for bomber kills. Some succeeded, but most were shot to pieces before reaching their targets, M8 rounds turning their final dives into funeral pyres. The colonel from North Carolina reading after-action reports noticed a pattern. German fighter losses were increasingly attributed to fire rather than structural failure. Aircraft that might have survived conventional ammunition damage were being consumed by chemical fires that couldn't be extinguished at altitude. The low atmospheric pressure and cold temperatures at 25,000 feet should have inhibited combustion, but the M8's incendiary compound burned hot enough to create its own optimal conditions. It turned the inside of aircraft into furnaces that consumed everything combustible: fuel, oil, hydraulic fluid, rubber seals, even aluminum structure, if the temperature got high enough. The factory in Detroit had increased M8 production to 5 million rounds per month by July 1944. The assembly lines ran continuously, workers sleeping in shifts beside the machinery to maximize output. Quality control remained paramount. Each batch was tested for penetration, burn rate, and stability. Rounds that failed any test were recycled, their materials reclaimed for another attempt. The workers knew that somewhere over Germany, An American pilot's life might depend on that round firing properly, penetrating armor, and delivering its incendiary payload exactly as designed. There was no margin for error at 400 miles per hour and 5 miles altitude. The lieutenant from Texas, who'd started this narrative, had now been flying combat for 4 months. His kill tally stood at 17 confirmed, most achieved with less than 500 rounds total. He'd learned the Mustang's capabilities intimately, knew exactly how hard he could push it in a turn, how long he could sustain a climb, how much ammunition to save for the trip home. But mostly he'd learned patience. The M8 rounds gave him options. He didn't need to achieve perfect positioning for a killing shot. He just needed to put rounds into the enemy aircraft's general vicinity and let chemistry handle the rest. The Germans' armor worked against them now, trapping fire inside their aircraft like ovens. He'd written home about the technical aspects of his work, careful to avoid anything that might worry his mother. He described the Mustang as a fine piece of machinery, the pinnacle of American engineering. He didn't mention the German pilot he'd watched burn in his cockpit for 30 seconds before the canopy finally released. Didn't describe the way aircraft came apart when M8 rounds found their ammunition stores. Didn't explain that he'd stopped keeping track of kills after number 10 because they'd stopped feeling like victories and started feeling like executions. The war had become industrial, impersonal, inevitable. The M8 rounds were just tools, like hammers or wrenches, designed for a specific purpose and excellent at their job. The August 1944 missions to southern Germany showed the final evolution of the air war. German fighters hardly rose to challenge anymore. When they did, they were often flown by inexperienced pilots who'd had fewer than 20 hours in type. These newcomers had heard the stories about American fighters and their burning ammunition. They flew tentatively, always looking for escape routes rather than pressing attacks. The Mustang pilots almost felt sorry for them, almost. Then they remembered friends lost to German fighters earlier in the war, bombers shot down with 10 men aboard, and they squeezed their triggers with steady pressure. The M8 rounds didn't care about the target's experience level. They burned through veteran or novice with equal efficiency. The major from Ohio had started painting small fire symbols next to his kill markings. Other pilots adopted the practice, a grim acknowledgement of what their ammunition actually did. Ground crews began calling M8 rounds pilots' matches because they lit up German fighters like striking a match. The joke was morbid but necessary. Humor was how they processed the reality of burning other human beings to death at altitude. The alternative was to think too much about it, and thinking too much about it meant hesitation, and hesitation meant giving the enemy a chance to do the same to you. The September missions saw German jet fighters in increasing numbers. The Me-262 was faster than any Mustang, could climb and dive at rates that left propeller fighters behind. But jets had vulnerabilities too. They needed long concrete runways that made attractive targets for bombing. They consumed fuel at prodigious rates, and their engines, for all their revolutionary design, were still vulnerable to M8 rounds. One Mustang pilot caught a 262 during takeoff, its pilot concentrating on nursing the temperamental engines to full power. A 2-second burst put 30 M8 rounds into the jet's fuselage. The incendiary compound found the fuel lines feeding those thirsty turbines. The resulting explosion scattered jet engine components across half a mile of German countryside. The lieutenant from California who scored that kill had been a chemistry major at Berkeley. He understood exactly what happened when the M8's incendiary compound met jet fuel. The reaction was exothermic, self-sustaining, and accelerated by the oxygen-rich environment of a jet engine intake. The German pilot probably experienced about half a second of recognition before the explosion. Not enough time to react, barely enough time to register that something was wrong. It was, the lieutenant reflected, probably more merciful than burning slowly in a conventional fighter. But mercy was relative at 20,000 feet, and 400 miles per hour. The supply chain had become so efficient that forward bases in France were receiving M8 ammunition within days of production. The rounds traveled from Detroit to New York by train, New York to Southampton by Liberty ship, Southampton to forward airfields by truck. Each step was optimized, prioritized, protected. Luftwaffe intelligence knew about the ammunition, but could do nothing to stop its flow. Bombing the factories would require penetrating American airspace, impossible with their current resources. Intercepting shipments meant getting through the Royal Navy and Allied air cover. Attacking the supply dumps in France meant facing the very fighters armed with the ammunition they were trying to destroy. The October battles over the Rhine showed how completely the balance had shifted. German fighters attempting to protect bridges from Allied bombing faced 10-to-1 odds against Mustangs carrying full loads of M8 ammunition. The bridges fell one by one, and with them went Germany's ability to shift forces efficiently. The Luftwaffe made desperate attempts to protect critical crossings, but desperation wasn't enough against superior numbers armed with superior ammunition. One German ace with 40 kills to his credit was shot down by a Mustang pilot on his third mission. Experience meant nothing when 6 streams of mixed ball and incendiary converged on your aircraft. The private from Wisconsin working in the salvage yard had the grim duty of processing crashed aircraft. American planes were stripped for usable parts. German aircraft were studied for intelligence value. He'd examined hundreds of impact sites, could tell from the wreckage pattern what kind of ammunition had brought the aircraft down. Regular ball ammunition left relatively intact wreckage. 20mm cannon damage was localized, but severe. But M8 strikes were distinctive. The wreckage was burned, twisted, often scattered across acres from secondary explosions. He'd found one German fighter that had been hit by perhaps a dozen M8 rounds. The entire center section was gone, vaporized by fire so intense it had melted the engine block into an unrecognizable lump of aluminum and steel. The November fog that traditionally protected German industry from bombing proved no defense against radar-equipped bombers with Mustang escorts carrying M8 ammunition. German fighters trying to intercept in bad weather found themselves caught by Mustangs they never saw. The first indication of attack was often M8 rounds, punching through their aircraft's skin, the incendiary compound igniting fuel or oil or hydraulic fluid. By then it was too late. The fire would spread faster than any extinguisher system could suppress it. The pilot's only option was to bail out and hope his parachute didn't tangle in the clouds. The captain from Indiana had developed a reputation for finding German fighters in bad weather. He had exceptional eyesight and an intuitive understanding of where enemy aircraft would position themselves relative to cloud formations. He'd shot down 6 aircraft that never saw him coming, each kill achieved with minimal ammunition expenditure. The M8 rounds gave him confidence to take shots at longer range, knowing that even marginal hits could prove fatal. His gun camera footage was used for training, showing new pilots how to maximize the effectiveness of their ammunition mix. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in reality. They had aircraft, but few experienced pilots. They had airfields, but little fuel. They had the will to fight, but no answer to Mustangs, armed with ammunition that negated every defensive advancement they'd made. The Battle of the Bulge saw their last major effort. Every available fighter was thrown against Allied air power in support of the ground offensive. The result was massacre. Mustangs shot down over 300 German aircraft in 2 weeks, many falling victim to M8 rounds that turned their aircraft into falling stars over the frozen Ardennes forest. The lieutenant from Vermont flying during the Battle of the Bulge had seen enough burning aircraft to last several lifetimes. He'd stopped thinking of them as containing human beings. They were machines to be destroyed, targets to be serviced, threats to be eliminated. The M8 rounds made the job easier, cleaner in a tactical sense, if not a moral one. One burst, one kill, move to the next target. He'd shot down 4 German fighters in a single mission, expending less than 300 rounds total. His crew chief joked that he was getting too efficient, that ammunition suppliers would go out of business. The joke fell flat. Everyone knew the war was ending, and with it would end their strange brotherhood of aerial executioners. The factory in Detroit had produced over 50 million M8 rounds by January 1945. They'd refined the process to where each round cost 27 cents to manufacture, down from 30 cents at the start. That 3-cent savings multiplied by 50 million represented enough money to build several hundred additional Mustangs. It was the kind of efficiency that won wars, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through incremental improvements that accumulated into overwhelming advantage. Each M8 round was 3 cents of American industrial might that could burn through German armor and German hope with equal facility. The major from Maryland, flying his 78th mission in February 1945, encountered something he hadn't seen in months: an aggressive German fighter pilot. The Messerschmitt came out of the sun in a classic bounce, cannons firing. The major broke hard left, pulling 7 Gs, vision tunneling from the blood draining from his brain. The German followed him through the turn, continuing to fire. This was someone who knew his business, probably one of the few remaining expert 10. The major reversed, rolling right and diving. The German anticipated it, cutting across the circle to regain position. This was the kind of fight that would have been decided by pilot skill 6 months ago. Now it would be decided by ammunition. The major let the German get closer, almost into killing position. Then he pulled straight up, using the Mustang's superior power-to-weight ratio to zoom climb. The German followed, his heavier aircraft bleeding speed quickly. At the top of the climb, both aircraft hanging on their props, the major kicked full rudder and brought his nose around. The range was less than 100 yards. His burst lasted perhaps a second. 30 rounds, 6 of them M8 armor-piercing Incendiary. 2 M8 rounds hit the German's canopy, punching through the armor glass. The Incendiary compound ignited inside the cockpit. The major saw the flash of fire, the German pilot's frantic attempt to bail out, the Messerschmitt falling away in an uncontrolled spin with orange flames visible through the shattered canopy. The German never made it out. The final months of the air war were less combat than execution. German fighters that dared to fly were hunted down by packs of Mustangs. Many German pilots chose to destroy their own aircraft rather than see them shot to pieces by American fighters. The M8 rounds had become legendary, mythical almost in their destructive capability. German pilots told stories of friends whose aircraft had been vaporized by single hits, of ammunition that burned underwater, of rounds that could penetrate tank armor. Most were exaggerations, but the truth was terrible enough. The M8 had ended the age of armored fighters by making armor irrelevant. The lieutenant from Arizona flew one of the last combat missions of the European War. He encountered a lone Focke-Wulf 190 over Prague, its pilot probably trying to escape to Sweden. The German made no attempt to fight, simply diving for the deck and running. The lieutenant followed him down, closing slowly. He could have ended it at any time, but something made him hesitate. The war was essentially over. This German pilot would never threaten another bomber, but orders were orders, and enemy aircraft were to be destroyed. He fired a short burst from maximum range. The M8 rounds reached out across half a mile of sky. One found the Focke-Wulf's engine, penetrating the oil cooler. The incendiary compound met hot oil at pressure. The engine seized, caught fire, forced the pilot to bail out. The lieutenant circled once to confirm the pilot's parachute had opened, then headed home. Even in victory, there was no satisfaction in burning men out of the sky. The war in Europe ended with American fighters owning the sky from London to Berlin, from Oslo to Rome. The Mustang had proved that a fighter could be fast, maneuverable, long-ranged, and heavily armed all at once. But it was the ammunition that had made the difference. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary round had negated every advantage German fighters possessed. Speed meant nothing if you couldn't escape. Armor meant nothing if rounds burned through it. Experience meant nothing if chemistry could kill you faster than you could react. The German pilots who had laughed at American .50 caliber machine guns in 1943 were dead or grounded by 1945, victims of American industrial innovation that turned simple bullets into chemical weapons. The colonel from Texas, who commanded a Mustang group, tallied the final statistics. His group had shot down 412 German aircraft in 18 months of operations. They'd expended approximately 2 million rounds of ammunition, of which 400,000 had been M8 armor-piercing incendiary. Simple division showed that roughly 1 of every 5 rounds fired was designed to burn through armor, and those rounds had accounted for an estimated 60% of kills. The gun camera footage showed why. Regular ball ammunition might damage an aircraft. M8 rounds destroyed it. The difference was fire, immediate spreading, inextinguishable fire that turned aircraft aluminum into fuel for its own destruction. The factory workers in Detroit received word of Germany's surrender while working the night shift. They'd produced their last batch of M8 rounds for the European war that afternoon. Someone had painted "Berlin or Bust" on the final shipping container. The workers celebrated briefly, then returned to their stations. The Pacific War continued, and Marine corsairs needed ammunition for their fights against Japanese fighters. The M8 round that had burned through German armor would soon meet Japanese aircraft with their minimal armor and unprotected fuel tanks. The results would be even more devastating. The major from California who had transferred to the Pacific found the air combat there different, but the ammunition equally effective. Japanese fighters relied on maneuverability rather than armor for protection. They could turn inside any American fighter, climb at impossible angles, hang on their props in ways that defied physics. But they burned. God, how they burned. One M8 hit was usually fatal. The incendiary compound found bamboo structures, fabric-covered control surfaces, unprotected fuel lines. Japanese pilots called them Hellfire rounds and developed an almost superstitious fear of American .50 caliber guns. They'd attack bombers from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire, even if it meant reducing their own effectiveness. The private from Georgia maintaining Mustangs on Iwo Jima had seen both theaters of war. He'd been at Debden when the first Mustangs arrived in England, had loaded the first belts of M8 ammunition, had watched pilots learn to trust their new weapons. Now he watched the same evolution in the Pacific. Pilots who'd struggled against maneuverable Japanese fighters discovered that M8 rounds didn't require perfect positioning. Clip a Zero's wing, and the whole aircraft might go up in flames. Hit the engine cowling, and burning oil would blind the pilot. Strike anywhere near the fuel tanks, and the aircraft would explode like a bomb. The ammunition that had defeated German armor was even more effective against Japanese aircraft that had sacrificed everything for performance. The final tally would never be completely accurate. Thousands of German aircraft had fallen to M8 rounds, many disappearing into forests or lakes or the English Channel, their destruction credited but unconfirmed. The Detroit factory had produced over 60 million M8 rounds by war's end. At roughly 1 pound per 4 rounds, that represented 15 million pounds of sophisticated ammunition, enough to fill a train 70 miles long, enough to arm every Mustang sortie with hundreds of rounds of chemical fire, enough to ensure that when American fighters met enemy aircraft, the outcome was rarely in doubt. The lieutenant from Texas who'd opened this narrative survived 91 missions. He'd shot down 23 German aircraft, each marked by a small swastika painted beneath his canopy. He never painted the fire symbols other pilots used. The memories were vivid enough without visual reminders. After the war, He went home to Texas, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 kids, and never spoke about what M8 rounds did to aircraft and the men inside them. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he'd step outside and look at the stars. He'd remember a Messerschmitt turning into a meteor at 25,000 feet, the pilot trapped inside as chemical fire consumed everything combustible. He'd remember the smell of cordite and burned aluminum that somehow penetrated oxygen masks and sealed canopies. He'd remember the terrible efficiency of American chemistry married to American industry. The German pilots who survived had their own memories. They'd entered the war believing in technological superiority, in the excellence of German engineering, in the superiority of cannon over machine gun armament. They'd laughed at American fighters with their rifle-caliber weapons. That laughter had died somewhere over Germany when the first M8 rounds started finding their marks. By war's end, they'd learned that technological superiority was temporary, that engineering excellence meant nothing if the enemy could negate it with chemistry, that 6 50-caliber machine guns firing the right ammunition were more terrible than any cannon. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary round remained in service long after the war, refined and improved, but essentially the same concept. Penetrate armor, deliver incendiary compound, create fire that couldn't be extinguished. It was a simple idea that had changed the nature of air combat. German pilots had expected to fight a war of maneuver and positioning. Instead, they'd been destroyed by American industrial capacity that could produce millions of rounds of ammunition that burned through their best defenses. They'd prepared for the last war and found themselves fighting the next one, where chemistry was more important than armor, where production capacity trumped individual skill, where a 27-cent bullet could destroy a $100,000 fighter and its irreplaceable pilot. The workers at the Detroit factory moved on to other projects after the war. Some went to the automotive industry, applying their precision manufacturing skills to building cars instead of ammunition. But they remembered the years when they'd worked around the clock producing M8 rounds, when every correctly assembled round might save an American pilot or doom a German one. They'd been as much a part of the air war as any pilot or crew chief. Their contribution had been measured in properly filled incendiary cavities, in perfectly machined penetrator tips, in quality control that ensured every round would function when needed. They'd won the war one round at a time, 27 cents at a time, one burned German fighter at a time. The Mustang pilots formed associations after the war, gathering annually to remember and drink and avoid talking directly about what they'd done. They spoke in code about good hunting and happy days, and when we owned the sky. They didn't discuss the German pilots they'd burned alive at altitude, the aircraft they'd turned into funeral pyres, the effectiveness of M8 rounds against human flesh. Those memories were private, carried individually rather than shared collectively. Each man dealt with them in his own way. Some threw themselves into work, some drank, some found religion. Most simply moved forward, filing the memories away with all the other things that had been necessary but were better forgotten. The evolution of the M8 round continued after the war. Korean War pilots discovered it was effective against communist armor and vehicles. Vietnam saw its use against riverine targets and light structures. Each conflict refined the concept, but the basic principle remained unchanged. Penetrate, burn, destroy. It was American pragmatism distilled to its essence. Find what works, make it better, produce it in overwhelming quantities. The German pilots who had laughed at American machine guns in 1943 had failed to understand this fundamental aspect of American warfare. By the time they recognized their error, they were falling from the sky in burning aircraft, victims of chemistry they didn't understand, and industrial capacity they couldn't match. The last surviving Luftwaffe ace was interviewed in the 1990s about his experiences fighting American fighters. He spoke carefully, respectfully about the Mustang's performance and the skill of American pilots. When asked about American ammunition, he paused for a long moment. "The burning rounds," he finally said, using the literal translation of what German pilots had called M8 us. "They made our armor worthless. They made everything worthless. You could be the best pilot in the world, but if those rounds found your aircraft, you burned." We stopped laughing very quickly when we understood what they could do. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more.